If you've been with us the last few weeks, you know that we have been in a series that we've been calling The Choices We Make. And as we've walked through this series, we have looked at a number of different choices that we walk through in life. We've looked at things that when we go our own way, when we make our own choice rather than doing the things that God wants us to do, we've looked at the results of that and what happens in all of our lives. And so today we are wrapping this up. And if you've been with us, you know that this is what we're calling a progressive series. So it's building. One message builds on the next. And so this is the top of it, okay? This is everything else has been foundational leading up to this point. So this builds on some of the things that we've talked about already. And you'll see that as we're in the message today. If you haven't been with us, I would encourage you to go back online and watch the last few weeks, the last 3 weeks, to catch up, to get to where we are today. If you don't want to go online and say, I need an easier way to do it, you can always sign up for the newsletter, and guess what? The messages will show up magically in your inbox on Tuesday. So you can just take the green card and the seat back in front of you and put your name and email address at the top of that. And if you don't have anything else on there, we'll know that you want to be signed up for the newsletter if you want to be a part of that. So anyway, today, like I said, we are wrapping up this series that we're calling The Choices We Make. And as we do that, I want to ask you a question as we get started. You don't have to answer this out loud, but here's the question. What are you known for? If I were to ask your friends and your family, if I were to interview the people that are closest to you, your coworkers or your employer or whoever, if I were to ask them that question about you, what would they say? What are you known for? I think all of us have our identities, the things that make us us, right? And it sometimes depends on the circles that we're in terms of what people would say about us and say, what we are known for. When I was in California a number of years ago, I was pastor of a church there. And I pastored that church for several years, but really became known for one thing in that church and couldn't get away from this reputation. So I will introduce you to a new part of my identity this morning, all right? So when I was in California, we did baptisms a little different than we do here. We didn't have the oversized kiddie pool. And so what we did was we would actually go to the Pacific Ocean to do baptisms. These pictures are from way back in 2002. Some of you weren't born then, some of you were, but you just can't remember all the way back to 2002. And so if you've ever been to the ocean in Northern California, you know that the water is chilly. It is a little bit cold. And so when we did baptisms, we had wetsuits, and we would put on our wetsuits, and we would stand on the beach, and we would say everything that needed to be said while we were on the beach, because you really couldn't hear once we got out in the water. The waves would be coming in, and at times the waves are like 8 to 10 feet tall that are coming in. And so we would say everything, then we would look for kind of an opening, a break in the waves so that we could walk out there and do the baptism and get out and come back. That's the way it's supposed to work. But on this particular occasion, a guy named Jesse, who is on the end, on your right over here, he is the one that is being baptized. And Jesse had some problems with his legs and his feet and had some stability issues. And so that's one of the reasons that we had two pastors that were going to be on either side of him, because we're going to be in the ocean where the waves are coming and all of that. And so we start walking out into the ocean and get out there and get ready to do the baptism. And as you can see, a wave crashed behind us, right? And so we decided, all right, we're just going to brace and hold on and get through this. And then we'll baptize him. And we did. We put him under the water, and as we're bringing him back up, something went wrong. You can tell from the video there, from the picture there, that something happened. And what happened was Jesse's feet and my feet got tangled up. And one of us was going down. I mean, it was inevitable, right? One of us was taking the fall on this thing. And so since he was already holding on to the other pastor, I decided I'm just letting go, and I'm gonna go with it here. And I did. I let go, and as you can see, I just totally disappeared. I popped up down shore somewhere later on. And so for the rest of the time that I was the pastor of this church, I was kind of known as the pastor who got baptized more than the guy that got baptized. right? And so, if you went and talked to some of those people today, and if you walked in some of those circles, they would still refer to me in that way. They would still make fun of me and laugh at me about the fact that I got baptized more than the guy who was actually supposed to be baptized. It depends on our circles to some degree, but all of us are known for something, right? Maybe you're known for your job. Maybe you're known for your family. Maybe you're known for something that you said at some point in time or said online at some point in time. But all of us are known for something. And what we're talking about today as we wrap up this series on choices is we're talking about our identities. And so as we think about that, I want to take one step further and ask you one more question related to your identity. And that is this. What if everything that you had ever done was right here in front of us? What if everything that you had ever said, good and bad and all of that, was right here for everybody in this room to see? What if everything that you had ever done in public to help somebody, or everything that you had ever done in private trying to hide stuff, what if all of that was right here in front of us? As we looked at that history of your life, what would you be known for? We have our public identity and we have our private identity, and all that shapes us, all that forms us. Our public identity is the way that other people know us. Our private identity is the way that we kind of think about ourselves, and the way that we think maybe God looks at us sometimes. And so we have those two identities there. But the reality is, each of those identities are made up of choices. The reason we have those identities is because we've made certain choices in life. We've been in certain places in life. And like we talked about a few weeks ago, really the sum of our lives can almost be put in two containers, where we say we are made up by our heritage, by what our family gave us, by where we were born, by the culture we were born into, and then we're made up by our choices. Those two things really sum up almost the entirety of our lives and our identities. And so as you think about that today, we're going to talk about a new way to understand our identity, the way that God wants us to understand it. If you've been with us from the beginning of this series, you know that we started by asking the question, what happens if we choose our way over God's way? And we looked at some universal truths of what happens, not just consequences, but what actually happens when we choose our way over God's way. And last week, Stephen started transitioning us, and so now we're asking the question, what happens when we choose God's way over our way? And again, we're looking at a big idea here, something that I think God says is radically important for you to understand if you want to choose God's way over your way. So to answer that question, I want us to look at a passage in the book of Exodus. Exodus chapter 21 is where we're going to be. And if you have read through Exodus anytime recently, you may remember that Exodus chapter 20 is a famous chapter in the Bible. Does anybody remember what is in Exodus chapter 20? 10 Commandments. That's exactly right. And so you may remember that God has just brought the people of Israel out of Egypt, right? They're starting to head up toward the promised land. And he starts giving them these laws, or these commandments. And really what he is doing is he is setting up for them a way to understand how to live as free people. For 400 years, they've been slaves. They've been in captivity. For 400 years, for generation after generation, all they've known is how to live in captivity. And now God is saying, let me show you what you need to consider if you want to live well as free people. All right, and so he gives them the 10 Commandments, and you may remember how he gave them the 10 Commandments. He gave it to them on stone, but before he did that, he actually gave it to them out loud. I don't know if you remember that part, but go back and read Exodus 20 today. You'll see it after he gives them the 10 Commandments, because the way the people of Israel respond to God speaking out loud to them in that way is they basically say, I'm going to need a whole community worth of new underoos here, because that scared us to death. You know, we don't ever want to hear you speak out loud again. And they say, God, why don't you just speak to Moses? And we'll just trust that whatever he tells us comes from you, right? And so the rest of the book of Exodus is God speaking through Moses. He tells Moses the laws that they need to follow. And Moses basically transfers those over to the people of Israel. So that's where we're going to be, Exodus chapter 21. And we're going to just look at a few verses in Exodus chapter 21 this morning. It starts off by saying this: these are the laws you are to set before them. If you buy a Hebrew servant, he is to serve you for 6 years. But in the 7th year, he shall go free without paying anything. If you're anything like me, you're looking at the big picture here, and you're kind of thinking, God just brought them out of slavery, and he's teaching them how to live as free people, but he's telling them how to have slaves. That seems kind of messed up. I mean, that doesn't seem quite right, what's going on here. And so just to explain a little bit of what's happening here, God's not telling them to take their cousins and their brothers and their sisters and the other Hebrews, the other Jews, and make them slaves again. That's not what God is saying here. In fact, he's doing something really gracious. So when he's telling them that they can have Hebrew servants, he's not saying you beat them over the back with a whip and you give them hard labor and you make their lives miserable and you make them your slaves. Now, what he's actually saying is he's saying some people in the free world don't do life very well. And they get themselves in trouble and they get into debt that they can't repay. And when people get to that point where they are in debt that they cannot repay, he's telling these Jews, he's saying, you bring your cousins or whoever it is that's in the mess, you bring them into your house and you treat them as your servants so that they can pay their debt off by working it off, right? But you let them live with you, you let them eat from your table, they live under your roof. You take care of them where they couldn't take care of themselves as free people. And that's the setup that God is giving them here. It's really a gracious thing, and that's going to be important as we look at this a little bit later on, all right? So he's telling them there is a situation, there is a time where people make bad decisions, and as a result of their bad decisions, they may need to come live in your house for a while. So that they can work off the debt that they owe to you. Going on in verse 3, he says this: if he comes alone, meaning he the guy that's going to be your servant, if he comes alone, he is to go free alone. But if he has a wife when he comes, she is to go with him. That part makes perfect sense, right? And then you read verse 4, and it says this: if his master gives him a wife, and she bears him sons or daughters, the woman and her children shall belong to her master, and only the man shall go free. It's like, wait a minute, this is getting really, really weird, right? If he comes alone, but gets married and has kids, when he goes free after 6 years of service, the wife and the kids don't go with him. What is all of this about? And again, think about what's going on in the context, okay? What he's saying is, if you invited somebody into your house who owed you a debt, who was not doing life well on their own, and they ended up marrying one of your daughters, and had kids, and then wanted to go back out and do life the way they had always done life, where they had gotten themselves in trouble before, where they had gotten into a mess before, he says you don't send the wife and the kids with them. They have to go alone. And so he gives them another option. He says this in verse 5. He says, but if the servant declares, I love my master and my wife and children, and do not want to go free, then his master must take him before the judges. He shall take him to the door or the doorpost and pierce his ear with an awl. Then he will be his servant for life. All right, so we read through all of that, and he gives them this incredible option at the end where he says, if you love your master, if you come to a point where you decide, you know what, I actually do life better under somebody else's roof than I do off on my own, he says, you can say, I want to be a slave for life. And the way that you make this known to the world, the way that you make this public is, first of all, you go to the judge and you get permission, you get approval, you make sure that both sides are saying the same thing. And after you do that, you go to the doorpost of the house. And you lean up against the doorpost, lean your head up against the doorpost, and take it all and run it through your ear. Sounds pleasant, right? I mean, I don't know what you think of when you think of an awl. But basically, in this period of time, what it would have been is it would have been a bone. They probably would have taken a bone from an animal and sharpened the end of it, and they run that through your ear as a way to say that you are now a slave for life to this person by choice. You have willingly decided to do that. I don't know if that sounds like fun to you, but I don't want to have a bone run through my ear. I mean, I don't care how much you sharpen it. You know, a bone is still a pretty thick thing to work with. Ironically, with our kids, we have all girls, as most of you guys know, and with our kids, we gave them a birthday present decision where at the age of 7, they could decide if they wanted to have their ears pierced, they could have their ears pierced. And this is, you know, our great gift to them is we will run a hole through your ear if you want that to be done. And, you know, the next year we said, this year we will kick you in the shin if you want to have that done this year. No, we, you know, obviously didn't say that. But it's just, you know, it's kind of funny. We give that as a reward now in our culture and in our society. And in this culture and society, it was a statement. It was a statement to the entire world. Because if you run it all through your ear, that doesn't go away, right? That leaves a mark. And so for the rest of your life, everybody can see that. That's a prominent place on your face. Everybody can see that and know that this person is a slave for life. They have chosen to be a slave for life. And you can see that God was telling them this is the way that people should relate to each other, but maybe you're starting to see there's a parallel thing going on here as well, where God is saying, this is the way that you can relate to me if you choose to. You can choose to go off and do your own thing. You can choose to make your own decisions. You can choose to go your own way. Or you can choose to live in my house and feast at my table and have me take care of you if you will just be my slave for life. And we cringe a little bit at the word. We cringe a little bit at the thought. But really what God is doing here is he's given us an incredible opportunity. We just sang that he is a good, good father, right? And he's inviting us into his home, saying, why don't you come do life with me? And so you might ask the question, well, why do they do that whole thing with the ear? I mean, other than just making a public spectacle here, why would you do that to somebody's ear? And think about the symbolism. I mean, they don't do this, they didn't put a tattoo on the shoulder. They didn't brand somebody on the hip. They pierced their ear. And the whole reason they would pierce their ear is because they're making a statement that from this point forward, I am listening to someone else. I'm not making decisions on my own. I am doing things based on what I hear from my master. I am choosing to do things his way rather than my way. That's the whole purpose of having the ear as the symbolic piece that they pierce here, is because they're setting this up to say, I am giving myself willingly over to the thoughts and the direction of my master. It's a pretty powerful picture of what God says should happen in all of our lives, honestly. That if we come to a place where we say, I am following Jesus, it shouldn't just be, I want you to be my Savior, I want you to die in my place, but it should be, I want you to be my Lord as well, where I listen to you and I follow you as you direct me. I no longer choose my way, but I choose the way of God. That's the way it's supposed to be. And when that happens, you know what else comes with that? You get a new identity. You get an identity that now you're not identified by what you've done in the past. You're not identified by the decisions that you made or even the things that you said in the past. Now you're identified. Everybody sees you as that's a person who belongs to that master. You get a new identity when you come into his house as well. And so this is an incredible picture that God paints for us. And it's not just recorded in Exodus chapter 21. It's actually something that everybody in Scripture picks up from there and carries on all the way through into the New Testament. And when we get into the New Testament, the language changes from Hebrew to Greek. And so the words that are used in the New Testament are kind of interesting in relationship to this. There are two Greek words that I want to share with you quickly. The first Greek word is the word for servant. And that word is diakonos. The second Greek word that I want you to know is the word for slave. And that word is doulos. And you've probably heard the phrase before, I'm a servant of God. I'm a servant of Jesus Christ. Something along those lines. But the reason I'm showing you these words is because if you go and look in the New Testament, if you actually looked at it in the Greek, there is not a single place in the New Testament that uses the word diakonos to talk about our relationship with God. We are never called servants of God. Because the implication is if you're a servant, you go serve, and then you can go do your own thing after that. It's almost like going to work, right? You can go to work at 8 o'clock in the morning, and you serve there for a while, and then you go home, and you can do whatever you want when you go home. That's what a servant is. A slave is totally different, because a slave is with his master, is under the authority of his master 24/7 all the time. Right? And so every time the New Testament talks about our relationship to God, we are not called servants of Christ. We are called slaves. We're doulos. And for some reason, the translators of our Bibles, when they brought this into English, they wanted to just soften the blow for us a little bit, and they wanted to make this feel a little bit better, and so they used the word servant over and over again, but they used the wrong word. In fact, let me just give you a few examples. You remember there's a point where Jesus is talking, and he's talking about our relationship to money. And he says, you can't serve both God and money. Right? You remember that? That's not what he said. He said you can't be a slave to both God and money. Because you could serve both. You could go serve God and then go on your own way and serve money for a little while. Right? You can do that, but you cannot be a slave to both. You can't be 24/7 committed to what God is telling you and 24/7 committed to what money is directing you to do. It's impossible. It just doesn't work. There's another passage later in the book of Matthew where Jesus is telling a story, he's telling a parable, and as he tells this parable, he uses a phrase that we have heard before, and maybe you've even thought of this phrase when you thought of loved ones going to heaven or whatever. He says, well done, my good and faithful... No. Well done, my good and faithful slave. And so he changes the identity of the person to slave. And you come along and you start looking at the way that Paul writes his letters. And he writes these letters and he's introducing himself to these churches. And as he writes these letters, he often starts by saying, I, Paul, am a slave of Jesus Christ. And you come to the book of James, and James is the half-brother of Jesus. And James starts his letter by saying, I am James, the slave of Jesus Christ. And the same is said in Titus, and the same is said by Peter. And all through the New Testament, the idea is carried out that we cannot be servants of God. We can't just choose to go and be with God for a little while and then go do our own thing later. It says if we are going to have the kind of relationship with God that we're supposed to have, we are going to be slaves of God. If we're going to truly choose God's way over our way, we can't just stick our toe in the water and say, God, I'm going to choose your way this time, and hopefully that's going to reap benefits for the next 5 weeks, and I will choose my way as that's playing out. It doesn't work that way. He says you have to come to a point where you choose my way over your way all the time. You have to come to a point where your ear is pierced so that you are looking to me for direction rather than counting on your own wisdom. That's the only way that this works. If we go all the way over to the book of Revelation, there's a verse at the very end of Revelation that kind of ties all of this stuff that we've been talking about together. So I want to read it to you quickly. In Revelation 22, verse 3, it says this. It says, no longer will there be any curse. And again, just to set the stage, this is the last chapter in the Bible. Heaven and earth as we know them have passed away. God has recreated heaven and earth. And so he's talking about eternity here. And the way that he's talking about it, he says, no longer will there be any curse. If you were here with us a few weeks ago, you may remember this word because we looked at this word, curse. Curse is, it sounds like one of those religious words that just, when you're mad, you say, the curse word or whatever, you curse something. And there's a point in Genesis where because of what Adam and Eve did, God says the ground is cursed. And we talked about the fact that he's not like shaking his fist and saying, I'm mad and so I curse you, ground. And it's not that at all. The word cursed actually means separated from life, separated from your source of life. And so what he's saying is because humans turned over the authority for ruling the world to Satan, ruling the earth to Satan, the ground was separated from its life source. It was separated from God. And we get all the way to the end. So that was the very beginning, right? We get all the way to the end of the story in the last chapter of the Bible, and what it says is there is no more curse. You will never again be separated from God. There is no more death that happens. You're not separated from your source of life. And that verse goes on and says this, the throne of God and of the Lamb will be in the city. So God is dwelling with us, right? We are dwelling with him. There is no separation at all. And he finishes this verse by saying this, and his servants will serve him. After we've walked through all of these other passages, you might be asking, is that what it really says? What it really says in the Greek is doulos. It says his slaves. And the word serve, will serve him is closer to will worship him. And so what it's saying is for all eternity, this is your identity. Not that you're a slave who's getting beat on the back and being charged with hard labor, but you are a slave in that you are 24/7 under the care of God. Rather than making your own choices and going your own way, you are pierced through your ear to the point where you're listening to the living God above all else. That's how we're known for all of eternity. And I believe that what Scripture is telling us is it's saying if you want to know what it really means to choose God's way over your way, you have to stop thinking like a servant. You have to stop thinking that, I can do this with God some and I can do it on my own and I can handle this for a little while and then I'll let God handle it. You have to stop thinking like a servant and you have to start thinking like a slave. Who my only mission, my only goal is to carry out what I hear from my master. My only goal is to let him be Lord and to help me make decisions as I go. That's the key. That's what it all comes down to. And just because of the wording, because of the terminology, we wrestle with this. We struggle on the inside because we say, I don't want to be a slave. I live in America. It's all about freedom. It's all about me. And I want to be a slave. And God says, that's the way life works. Do you want to understand how to do life as a free person well? Become a slave of a good Father. I think if we were to wrap all of that up into one sentence, I think it would be something like this. Freedom from sin happens when we become slaves to God. It feels backwards. It feels like an oxymoron. It doesn't feel like it goes together. But freedom from sin happens when we become slaves to God. As we wrap up this morning, what I want us to do is we're going to sing a song in just a minute. And the song that we're going to sing is one that you just sang a second ago, where we're singing to God, saying to Him, I'm falling on my knees, offering all of me. Jesus, you are all that I'm living for. Guys, those are the words of a slave. When you're saying, I'm giving up my desire to choose on my own, and I'm offering everything that I am, I want you, Jesus, to be all that I'm living for. Those are the words of a slave. As we sing, maybe you just need to sing this to God and make that your prayer as you sing. Maybe this needs to be a time where you come to God, bow before Him, and say, I've not gotten this right. I've been following you, but I've not gotten this right. I've never truly been your slave. I've always been your servant who would come and go as I please, but I want to give my life. I want to follow you, and I want to listen to you above all. However God leads you to respond in this time, I would just ask that you respond genuinely to Him. Let's stand together and